Hello, everybody.
Um,
Welcome, welcome, welcome. So good to see the numbers climbing. I'm sure I'll see your chats and get to know you a little bit throughout this process. My name is Melissa Sanjay, and welcome to our UDL Guidelines 3.0 webinar series. This series is the essential updates and practical applications. So you may have seen Shantae and I a couple weeks ago do the overarching enhancements. And now we're going to talk about specifically about that engagement. I like to hold up my guidelines when I talk about them. That engagement column, that green column, talk about what are the enhancements that we've made there. You will see in the chat, Patrice is going to drop the links. Yes, Wendy, she's going to drop in just a second. The link to the PowerPoint. It will have links in there. You can either use that QR code or you can type that bit.ly straight into your URL. I'm going to move us forward, but if you miss the link, Patrice is going to keep dropping it as people come in. Hello, hi from Ireland, we got you.
oh wow, that's
Hello,
awesome.
Trudy. Nice. All right, so that chat box, thank you for jumping in there, Trudy and others, and saying who you are and where you're coming from. Corey, good to see you from New Hampshire. I love to see Mount Prospect here. You
Yeah.
can use that chat box to introduce yourself, to ask a question, to share an idea or quote. Sometimes people will quote things that folks said either in the chat or over the mic, and just to double down on it, say they really like that quote. You can put that hyperlink in for your colleagues if you have resources. Looks like we got Nebraska, Texas. Oh, Texas. There you go, Shantae.
There
Shantae's in
we go.
Bend,
Hello,
Oregon, Dallas, New
Canada.
Jersey, San Diego, Finger Lakes.
Florida, y'all be safe.
Say that?
I said I saw some folks from Florida, so I said y'all be safe.
That's right. Yeah. Hope you're all hunkered down there. Ontario, Canada, Seattle, Knoxville. Look at all that.
Yes,
Ohio,
Canada,
Prince
so much.
Edward Island. Awesome. Welcome, everybody.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, for sure. So you can use that chat box. A lot of folks have figured out how to use that chat box. You just want to select it either will say everyone or it'll say all panelists and attendees, depending on your version of Zoom, I think. And you can contribute. If you choose just the host or the panelists, then it'll just come to myself and Shantae. If you want to respond to something that folks said in that chat box, you can do @ in their name and respond directly to something they said. Either start having a conversation or tell them how much you agree with them or anything else. If you're also from Auckland, New Zealand, welcome, Bernd. You could also say that there in the chat. Just kind of get to know each other. That's the way we're going to be able to interact today.
Love it. And Melissa, before we go on, someone put UDL is not something we do, it's something we believe. I love that. Thank you for starting us off with that.
Nice. Thank you. Illinois, we got SUNY. Elif is saying she has a daughter there at Texas A&M.
No,
Awesome, right where you are, Shante.
there we go.
All right, our accessibility commitments. So we have taken steps, many of us, not just Shantae and I, but some of our folks behind the scenes. Shout out to Cassie, who's been helping us a lot with this, to make sure that this deck is accessible. So we use a tool to perform an automated check, Microsoft's accessibility checker. We also have checked manually to ensure the clear reading order of the screen reader users. And we're providing the deck to you so you can personalize your experience as we speak to go along with the deck, go a little forward, go a little back if you miss something. And we will welcome any feedback you have on improving this experience for you. We are always looking to improve, always looking to iterate and move forward. My name, as I said, is Melissa Sanjay. I'm an implementation specialist at CAST. That means that I go around the country, sometimes around the globe, to teach universal design for learning in different contexts. So sometimes I'm working with teachers, sometimes I'm working with school leaders on our school-wide implementation criteria. We do have a little plug. We do have a webinar coming up or a workshop series coming up about that. So Patrice has been putting that in the chat. So if you're interested in that, you can click that link and check that out. Prior to coming to CAST about 6 years ago, I was first a social worker and then a teacher and then a principal for about 17 years in Boston's alternative schools. So those are the schools for the students who are 14 to 21 and either dropped out or were pushed out of their homeschools, and they were coming back to get their credits. So that's where I came to UDL and really, out of necessity, found out how to make learning environments and spaces accessible for all students and allow them to have some agency in their learning. And my colleague Shantae is with me.
Yes, I am front and center with my dear colleague, Melissa. We've been spending a lot of time together, but hello, I'm from Bryan, Texas. Yes, home of Texas A&M here in Bryan College Station. I am Shantae Singer. I serve on both. I have the pleasure really of serving both on the professional learning team, where you'll see a lot of my existence online and behind the scenes. But I also have a foot in our research and development department here at CAST. And so it's so important, I believe, in making sure that there is that research to practice collaboration and connectivity. And so I love reading, doing, being enthralled in all of the research that exists. So prior to coming to CAS, I was actually at Service Center here in Texas, providing professional development around all things special education, so access, accessibility. And then prior to that, I was in Baltimore County Public Schools. I saw some of my folks from Maryland, where I was an instructional coordinator for special education. And so my heart was introduced, if you will, to UDL. My journey began there in Baltimore County. I wish I had known of the fabulous framework back when I was a special education teacher in DC public schools for quite some time, because I truly believe in the framework in terms of what it provides and what to not only students and learners, but also for teachers as we develop engaging and motivating and all the things related to learning experiences and environments. So anyway, I'm going to stop talking about myself and let's get in to the content.
Awesome. And I'm hoping that, you heard Shantae talk a little bit about the research to practice loop that we have at CAST, and that hopefully this webinar will try to kind of bring some of that alive. What's the research? What does it mean for our practice? But before we do that, let's talk a little bit about CAST. We have been doing these 3.0 webinars. We are the authors of the Universal Design for Learning Guidelines. And our mission is that CAST leads, inspires, and convenes a global community to design equitable, inclusive learning experiences through our Universal Design for Learning framework. And if you're not familiar with our Universal Design for Learning framework, I'm just going to give you a little definition, and there's going to be some free webinars you can go back and check out that you can dig a little deeper if you'd like. But in terms of a definition, what UDL is it's an educational framework based in research in the learning sciences that guides the development of flexible and accessible methods, materials, and environments that embrace variability, minimize barriers, and develop learner agency for all. And we do that primarily through our framework that it guides us on how to use these Universal Design for Learning guidelines. And that's what we're going to be talking about mostly today, is some of the enhancements or the changes in the Universal Design for Learning Guidelines 3.0. So how have we made it better, enhanced it, and wider from 2.2, as we used to call our previous version of the guidelines, to 3.0. So given that is kind of what we're going, let's set our intention today, because we know in UDL that our brains are goal directed. And if we set an intention ahead of a learning experience, it's going to cue our nervous system to pay attention to what we need to in order to achieve that goal. So the goals that this particular slide deck are aimed at are for you to understand the engagement enhances in 3.0, to understand the research behind those enhancements, and then be able to use those engagement enhancements in your practice. So given that's kind of what we're aiming for today, what are your goals for today? So you can take a minute, you can hold that in mind, you can write it on a sticky or anywhere you have in your learning space that you use to jot things down, or you can throw it in the chat and let us know so we can try to aim some of our comments and things that we say towards those goals.
Absolutely.
As we wait for those goals to come in, I'll read us over the, here we go. To learn about the updates and the rationale. Great. We'll have some of that, Tracy. We'll have some of why we changed it, some of how we changed it, and some of what we can do now that we have these changes. SEL and language strategies, nice engagement and practice, ideas for implementing updates in our program. Awesome. And we're also, Deborah, going to have a school leader webinar coming up. If you'll check out those guidelines 3.0 webinars that Patrice keeps dropping in the chat, there'll be some things for leaders too and how to implement them school-wide.
And I know we're here for engagement here today, but just know that we have had some other specific webinars on learner agency, on the overarching changes. And so some of you may find value in looking at those webinars that are posted currently on the UDL guidelines website.
Nice.
Nurture, join, play. Ooh, I love that. And
got a whole section for you,
like
Jessica.
high school. Yeah, exactly. Love that.
Awesome.
Better connect with the framework. I love your
All
goals.
Right. So big picture, what are these enhancements for engagement? The first is to center, affirm, and sustain learners' strengths and identities. And there is going to be an identity webinar that's going to go over that. And we went over it a little bit when we talked about the overarching changes. So we won't dig deeply into identities today, but that's one of the big changes to be aware of. Another of the big changes to be aware of is we're considering how we can address bias, threats, and distractions in learning. So that shows up in engagement, but it also shows up across the other guidelines as well. And we did have a whole webinar on bias and how to think about that and how to design to address it. So you can go and check that out in the 3.0 webinars. But today we're going to dig into these last three. Emphasize the role of belonging in teaching and learning, emphasize the role of joy in play in teaching and learning, and cultivate empathy and repair harm with restorative practices. So those are our considerations. We call them design considerations. So those are the considerations that we're highlighting that are new or enhancements from the 2.2. So our agenda will be to go over those enhancements, which we just did. We're going to start with belonging. We're going to go into nurture and play, and we're going to finish up with cultivate empathy and restorative practices. So let's dive in, Shantae.
Let's go. All right. So our first consideration that we are, or concept that we are diving into is this idea of belonging. And one thing we try to do is really provide some clarity around what we mean by the terms that we're going to be using today. So when we think about belonging, right, while we could come up with one definition, I want to make sure that it is grounded in literature and research. And so Fernandez et al., which there we will see a listing of our resources or references at the end of this presentation, but basically says that how a person defines belonging is based on their experiences. When we talked about bias, we talked a lot about like our truths are in our experiences. What we hold true is through our daily experiences, activities, cultures, things we've been taught. And so that sense of belonging is actually the same. How someone defines belonging is really about those instances where they have felt like they have belonged, and those instances where they felt like they have not belonged. And so Fernandez et al. Talks about the fact that when someone says they have a sense of belonging, they feel as though they can show up as their authentic selves. They are not an afterthought. Who they are has been considered in the planning, in the design, in the development of whatever it is we're referring to in the situation learning. They have also individuals, when they feel like they belong, are able to recognize and connect with others in the community. So within the UDL guidelines 3.0, we talked about collective learning. And so that part of being a community is also a large sense of what happens or what it means to belong. Melissa, you can go to the next slide. And so what we tried to do as well in our demonstration of or explanation of our enhancements is really talk about some of the themes that came up as we were talking to our communities, our advisory boards, and to give you specific quotes that were surfaced that really did drive us to make some of the enhancements to Guidelines 3.0. And so what you're seeing here is a few quotes from our advisory group, and we asked them, what this was something that popped up that we kind of categorized into this sense of belonging. We said, what does belonging really mean? It says a person feels like you're here, like this is your space. You're not invited to be a guest, but you're actually representative. This is for you, right? It's maybe the idea of being able to identify ways to feel welcome and valued and appreciated and loved. So people who have a sense of belonging feel this way in their space. It's their space. It's not ostracizing, or it's not something, like I said, an afterthought. Another quote that resonated or came up is that when you're developing a sense of belonging, you're building trust, right? You're building that trusting rapport. That there's people where you don't feel threatened, or you don't have to clock out. When you have a community, like you're engaged, you feel safe, right? And also by doing this, we're empowering the learner. We're making sure that they feel safe. We're making sure they feel welcomed and belong. So these are some of the quotes that popped up that really did resonate with us in terms of wanting to ensure that the guidelines provided this sense of belonging. All right, Melissa. So based on many of the conversations, as researchers, we categorized or we created themes around these ideas. And so what we noticed, even though the words caring and empathy and belonging came up, it didn't appear anywhere in our previous iteration. So if you're thinking about 2.2, the word belonging didn't appear anywhere. So we needed to fix that, right? We also recognized that we wanted to provide a space that was inclusive and equitable. And that happens when it is a place where when you feel like you want it, where you feel like you want to be. So a learning environment that is designed with the UDL guidelines in mind is a place where you want to be. It's a place where you feel like you've been thought of, and valued. And so we wanted to surface some of the research. Now, I will tell you kind of throughout, and you may hear me say this more than once throughout our conversation today, is that the pieces or research or literature that we pulled out is by no means what we're seeing is the best, or are the ones that you should rush and read. These are a sample of the research that support the changes that were made. So they're supporting these concepts of belonging. And so 3 in particular I wanted to highlight. The first one the first 2 are centered around this idea of belonging within higher education. And so Pedler et al. Talks about this sense of belonging. When students at the university level felt a sense of belonging, it was shown to contribute to their motivation. It allowed them to be more attentive and actually retain their participation at the university level. These also, as it relates to belonging, incorporated those feelings, like I mentioned before, of feeling valued. So when students felt valued, there was a greater sense of that belonging, which led to higher motivation, which led to more engagement, higher academic self-confidence, and overall higher achievement. The next piece of research that I wanted to, or literature that I wanted to explain to you, was Price, Smith, and Fox. And here they did a great job at really explaining how we create or to provide a process for designing an environment where inclusion and belonging was at the foundation. So I appreciate this article because it does provide how you set up spaces where students feel welcome and when they feel that they're valued, when they feel that they have been considered. And so this was something that we really did pride ourselves on in including in the enhancements. The last one is a little special to me because this talks about this need for authentic inclusion. And this actually was a article that was written. It was a narrative from a family of a student who, or of a child who was a neurodivergent learner. And I wanted to read just a snippet of this article for you, Melissa, and community, so that you can see exactly just how it feels for the authentic inclusion and how it demonstrates a sense of belonging. So early in kindergarten, Benny was invited to a birthday party with a sports team, and my husband took him to the party and waited on the side, yet called me soon with worry in his voice. It seemed Benny was running around acting like a puppy while the party organizers were trying to organize a sports game for the children. My husband was anxious and asked me what should he do. We both knew that Benny did not do well with redirection when he was stressed. I suggested that my husband hang back and see what happened next. He called back in a few minutes, to some extent relieved. It seemed that now many of the children were running around like dogs and cats. Benny was no longer alone. He told me that the other parents were laughing and the only folks who were bothered were the party planners. As a teacher, I knew then that had Benny's unusual behavior been made an issue of, the children would have shunned him rather than joining him. There's a fine line between shaping behavior and allowing children to be themselves. Here we see an example of the way that Benny was allowed to change the community rather than being forced to be the one to conform. So I love that because it really does foster, it really does demonstrate what a sense of belonging and community can actually be.
And to me, Shante, it sort of highlights how a lot of these ideas in 3.0 are intertwined. Because once we make space for a young person to be authentically themselves,
That's right.
not only are they feeling more belonging, but the other young people are having more empathy for different ways of moving throughout the world.
Absolutely.
So what does this look like in practice? So what are some ideas? What can we do to create those spaces so that students can belong or feel that sense of belonging? So one thing is to vary the activities and sources of information. We know that learners vary. We know that learners are going to connect to different things. So have a varied ways that we can personalize or contextualize to our learners' lives. Have culturally relevant and sustaining options, socially relevant, age and ability appropriate, or even appropriate for different racial, culture, ethnic, and gender groups. And the key there is to vary these activities and vary these sources so that there's space for everyone to sort of see themselves in the curriculum. Another thing you can do is have opportunities to share perspectives and ideas, because you, of course, cannot know every single young person, how they are and what their authentic self is, especially on day one. So how do we create that space for our students to share who they are, to share their perspectives and share their ideas, in particular around belonging, around what
Mhm,
do I need in this space to feel like I belong? What feels like
mhm,
home to me? What feels safe? And then in that process, as part of that safety, examine and address when and how bias may be creating barriers to belonging. So when you see young people's maybe shut down in terms of their sense of belonging because of something that is done, something that is said, something that exists in the
mhm.
space, we don't ignore it, we address it, and we talk about it. And that's going to come up even a little bit more when we talk about restorative practices. So those are some ideas. And as I say, they're kind of all intertwined, but we want to build this classroom community using these ideas. And we have a little example here we'll play for you. An idea, like a specific strategy on how to foster belonging in community from Edutopia. Oops.
There's so many.
There we go.
A sense of belonging is really critical for success in school. That sense that we are part of a larger whole, that there is a fit between me and my environment, But the data does suggest that students' sense of connection at all grade levels is on the decline internationally. There are pedagogical practices that convey to students, you belong here, and Jigsaw is a brilliant example of that. Jigsaw Classroom is classic research by Elliot Aronson that's inspired so much of the cooperative learning movement in U.S. education, and they found this to be very effective at reducing prejudice and improving the performance of minority students in the aftermath of desegregation. Basically, what you're doing is you're creating a collaborative situation where it's in people's self-interest to treat each other nicely and to cooperate. And so what he did was to create these small learning groups, 5 to 7 kids working together, and each individual gets a separate piece of the lesson plan. So if you're studying American history, one kid would get the original settlers, another kid would get something later in American history, like the 60s. Each kid, under the guidance of the teacher, becomes an expert in their little piece of the puzzle. And so each kid is kind of like a jigsaw piece. And it's only by pooling our information and sharing it that we can learn the whole lesson in its entirety. The brilliance of this is that there's so many positive outcomes. It's in the kids' interest to cooperate. It encourages kids to talk and get to know one another better. It fosters equal status. Another benefit is subjective, psychological. I learned that, hey, if I'm struggling on this work, it's like other people are often struggling too. So I don't take it as personally. There's social proof that it's the difficulty of the work and not something about me and my belongingness that explains my difficulty. I think what a lot of teachers, including myself, can get wrong is you can't just put people together into groups and say, go to it. Group learning, when it's structured appropriately, can make a world of a difference to those people who feel themselves to be or are seen as outsiders. If you can kind of bolster people at that key moment where they're trying to get a foothold, it can be a catalyst for health and achievement and growth.
All right. So we wanted to take a minute and just do a little reflection. What questions, ideas do you have about fostering belonging, and what strategies can you share? And I see we have some things in the chat about higher education settings. You want to address that, Shante?
Yeah, I was just gonna say I love that. And the two articles that were referenced were actually at the university or higher education level. So I totally appreciate those comments. Thank you for constantly reminding us that UDL is not just a K-12 framework. It really is there to support all of us.
Yeah, great. And belonging is the impact of belonging and learning is neuroscience, right? So
That's right.
it happens
Absolutely.
at all levels of development.
All levels.
Go ahead and type those things in the chat. What questions you have, what strategies you want to share. Just looking through some of the chats.
Mm-hmm. Research about.
Oh, there's a question about which two articles relate to higher ed, Shante.
It is, let me give you the one, if you're on the slide deck, excuse me. I just
Was it Peddler?
Peddler was one, and then the other one was Peddler was one, and then the other one was Fernandez.
Fernandez, great.
Mm-hmm.
Then we have another comment. I feel everyone has something to give. Others can learn from them. Their words are important and of value. Awesome.
And Fernandez was actually university in the United Kingdom, so it has an international perspective as well.
Awesome.
Yes, Peddler. Mm-hmm. And like I said, if you look at the slides at the bottom, we put the references, or put the references to the research articles that we have, as well as the UDL guidelines for each of the consideration. We do have research pages, and so we invite you definitely to explore those citations as you see fit.
Great. We have a comment in the chat about maybe something as simple as asking someone if you're pronouncing their name correctly when you meet them would
Absolutely.
build a connection. That flows right into how they identify as a person, right?
Yes, for sure. Video mention intention.
That you can go to that video link, and there should be more information in the comments on the YouTube around what the context is. I don't know the exact context, how they group their students, if it was by level or other ways. I don't know.
Understanding or choice or things like
Yeah.
that. Um,
Personal reflection assignments are opportunities. Talk about your feelings. Great. All right. They're
Thank
coming in
you all
right
for your
here, Miss Karen.
comments. Appreciate that.
You want to jump into joy and play?
Sure, let's.
Learner surveys. Nice.
Yes. So joy and play. This is again of particular importance to me as well, personally, also professionally. And so, like I said, I want to kind of give you a idea of what we mean by these terms as we're talking about them. So, in terms of joy, Goldie Muhammad defines joy as being fun and celebratory. It's related to advancing happiness, right? By elevating the beauty of humanity. I love that. As well as embracing truthful narratives and representation of diverse people in the world. And we'll get a little bit more into this when we talk about representation in a different seminar. But just the fact that we want to embrace differences, we want to embrace diversity, and when people see themselves in themselves, when they see themselves in what they're learning, this sparks a sense of joy. And play, Leather, Harper, and OB, which we'll talk about in one of the examples, defines play as not just about games. That's kind of where our head goes first when we think about play directly to games, but that playfulness is an attitude. And it's an approach, and it's a philosophy of life. So these are the definitions or kind of the grounding concepts or ideas that we'll hold for this next part of our conversation here today. Some of the quotes that came up, or some of the comments that came up in our various focus groups, and I believe this one was from our learner agency group, talked about the fact that our society really does value worth on production or titles, but that joy and play is huge, and it should be part of this shift, this paradigm shift. It's not just about being productive. And what this said to me is that it's not just about quantity, but it's about the quality, right? Then there was another comment that talked about teacher retention. So it says we have a huge issue about teacher retention. I think it boils down to the fact that educators, have lost their agency. They've lost their satisfaction. They've lost their connection to kids that relights their fire. It's all about getting the job done, and that they forget what the job is. Maybe the missing piece is our own heart to finding ourselves and establishing and rejuvenating ourselves. And so what's the why behind why you became an educator, right? And so just a few things, a few articles that I wanted to highlight here. And I saw that many of you talks about, how I incorporate joy and play into your, secondary or post-secondary environments. And excuse me. And so the first article here by Thiel and Wolin talks about this idea that play while learning has become really a privilege, right? So when you think about, and this very much resonated with me, but I think about as an instructional coordinator, when I went to observe sometimes the special education resource rooms, I noted some of the practices there. The constant drill, the constant practice, the constant conformity. But then when I visited the gifted and talented classrooms, there was a lot of creativity and innovation and thought process. And I wondered why there was this disparity between those two educational environments. And so within this article, he talks about the fact that, you know, we got to get back to bringing joy into learning because it fosters a sense of creativity and innovation as students are learning. The second one by Leather et al. Talks about supporting playfulness in the post-secondary education classroom. And so many of you are in the higher education content and wonder what this is like. So that article really does an amazing job at explaining not just how, but why playfulness is so important at that post-secondary level because, right, not only does it enhance creativity, but it fosters humor and motivation and positive inner emotions, with you will, which is so important when we think about not just belonging, but learning in general, right? We have this idea that play and joy is just for our babies, right? Like just early childhood, maybe. But no, as an educator, like I want to feel joy when I am teaching and when I am designing too. So I'd like to dispel that myth out there if it does exist. And then the last article that I wanted to highlight is Jennifer Adams' uh, this article on cultivating Black joy, and she does this with a focus on science learning. And so, if you haven't heard of Black joy, it is a framework for designing curriculum like research to practice, but it actually centers on Black liberation, and it offers oftentimes counter narratives to the dominant narrative that's often highlighted in the curriculum. So examples of one thing that comes to mind is when you think of a scientist, sometimes what are those, what are those dominant ideals or ideas of a scientist? And I remember I asked my students this, one time, and I had to remind them that we have scientists of different racial, ethnic identity backgrounds, right? It's not just the ones that we tend to see in our textbooks or the ones that we tend to see on TV, right? There are a plethora of other representations of scientists and who that is. And so this article talks about how we cultivate Black joy, if you will, by bringing Blackness and the Black liberatory education back into the curriculum.
And that
So
just
again, all of these, go ahead, Melissa.
Oh, that just highlights for me again this interconnectedness, right? So that counter narrative, making space for counter narratives is addressing bias, right? At the same time as allowing students to show up authentically with their full identity. So some of these big ideas of 3.0 weave throughout all of the new checkpoint enhancements.
Melissa, I love this comment in the chat. It says some of this is true for any profession. I recently introduced this guideline to medical students, and they struggled with it, though they loved it. And the feedback was it's hard to find play and joy in pure science and the high stakes multiple choice tests that are required to take in concepts that they need to know. And so I just that the UDL guidelines can definitely be used in other fields other than education. I feel like learning is across everything. Like we learn just by walking out the street sometime, right? And so I appreciate that comment.
Great, thank you. So some key takeaways from the research is, as we've said over and over, joy isn't just for children. We can all be joyful. We can all experience it. And that joy releases the serotonin and dopamine, and that supports long-lasting learning in our brains. Play sparks curiosity, wonder, and imagination that helps us to construct new understandings, make connections, develop relationships. And then that last piece around historically marginalized learners. Finding a sense of joy centers on ideas of freedom, imagination, and community and love, and it can even serve as an act of resistance to oppressive systems. So joy is powerful, right? It's not just fun, but it's powerful. So what does that look like in practice? So we talked about how we have joy in our learning and sort of put together this little gear shift, right? that will help us retain more information, improve our social connections. And as we improve our social connections, that fosters more joy. And it just, the hope is that just builds on itself. So what can we do in our classrooms and our universities? We can nurture exploration and discovery, like make space in our learning designs to really just explore. I'm getting a weird PowerPoint message. I hope that doesn't mess us up. Okay. We can nurture connections to curriculum. By having diverse representations in our curriculum, it can have our students be able to connect to more things. When there's more variety and diverse representations, there's more opportunities to connect to our identities, our self of self, and our community. And that builds pride and joy and connection and love and relationship. Have a space for students to shine. In trauma-informed practice, they call this creating islands of competence. And we saw that in the jigsaw activity where we became experts on one thing. And that really builds those good feeling chemicals and that sense of joy to really allow students to become experts. That we have some of the more common ones that we think about when we think about joy: games, role playing, art, music, sensory play, imaginative play, creations, creating things sparks joy in people, and storytelling. Storytelling is like the foundation of us as humans, and storytelling can often spark joy. I see something on the tip of your tongue, Shantae. Do I?
Oh no, I'm just excited about this. This one is, like I said, one that's near and dear to my heart. And so I just appreciate all of the examples here.
Nice. So we have a little video. This has some littles and some older students. It mostly focuses on K-12, but here's some ideas about playful approaches to joy in teaching.
I love the conversation.
Unfortunately, the closed captioning is not working on this video, but you can turn on your Zoom closed caption. It should caption it for you.
Oh, no, that one.
When students are really engaged and they want to be in the room and they want to be learning, that makes it so much easier for a teacher because you're all invested in the learning that's happening. So it does help a lot with burnout because everyone wants to be there.
It like really changes your outlook on it.
Right, so if we push this down. When I first started our play-based journey, I was very apprehensive about it because you are taking a step back and you are kind of letting the children lead their learning.
It's really about empowering children, allowing them to be part of their education, to be involved in planning, the organisation. The initial input can be quite heavy, but I think it's then a beautiful opportunity for me to be able to observe my children and how they're getting on and developing the skills.
Like that, yeah, go! One more time! Yeah!
You're also allowed to have props for your videos. So playful learning means different things for each class or each grade. And for my 9th graders, it means doing activities where the students are more creative or autonomous. The students always are in a frenzy in the beginning because there's so much stuff in here that they can touch and use. But that's what we want because that's an indication of them being motivated and them being engaged in the lesson and actually having fun with it.
Some trees, that would be a good idea.
I would say that it does benefit the teacher as well as the students.
That one down.
You have more flexibility with your time to get to know the children.
Yeah, fordi I havde lavet det i hånden, eller?
I didn't think it would come natural to me in the beginning. But every time we do something that's not what we would call traditional, it just brings a different energy.
Yeah.
Once upon a time, tell me about your beautiful house.
I don't like to be bored in the classroom, and so I often when I'm teaching, if I'm like, oh, I'm getting a little tired, that's when I say, okay, I got to do something to change it up. And you see it in their faces. So I think that's when I see them giggling and laughing, I say, yeah, that's it. That's great. They're going to go home and say, I had fun at school today, and that's what I want.
Look, I think someone's at the door.
Oh, I see what you're saying. You're muted, Melissa.
It froze, but I think we got the gist of it. I think that's the weird PowerPoint message it keeps giving me about media, enable media.
Oh, I see.
So, so we wanted to, let's go on to our reflection here. We have a couple different reflection questions. What questions do you have about joy and play? How would you convince people the value of joy and play? Because we know sometimes there's a little like push and pull around that. And what strategies can you share? I know you've been looking at the chat. What are you seeing in the chat, Chantal?
Yeah, so just one of the comments, when we talk about, you know, words like joy and play, and words are words, right? They're meant to convey meaning. But if you say potato and I say potato, they stand for the same thing, right? So if joy and play don't resonate with you, things like creativity or innovation or playfulness or enthusiasm, those can be used as well, right? And so I don't want us to get too bogged down on those words, because the words are just the words. It's the meaning behind, it's the act, it's the intention. Those are the things that we want to convey in the message. So, you know, I would love, we always love your feedback, but just know that, you know, it's the intent, right? Sometimes behind the words and how that can be portrayed in our design as we're establishing those environments.
Great. And we had a comment about maybe a good place to start is digging deeper into people's biases about the word play and joy. What do you really think we're talking about
That's
when we're saying play and joy? And then there's a question I think you might have some answers to, Shantae. I do a lot of virtual instruction with adults, ideas on creating joy and play in virtual learning spaces.
Right. Oh my gosh. So I have found, again, because like that's kind of the world I live in, both at CAS, but also as adjunct faculty at Texas A&M, right? That manipulation and choice are very good in terms of nurturing joy and play. There's something about if I have agency to decide how I want to do things, how the creativity comes out. So like, for example, instead of like having papers, even though I know that's sometimes a standard, right, that we have, doing things like creating presentations or creating apps or things like that so that students can express themselves really does, it senses there's a level of not just authenticity, but creativity. And I see the enthusiasm oftentimes from students when they have the choice of how they want to express or engage in the content. So even though that's just one suggestion, it's definitely something that I'd recommend for our higher education.
And one other question Tracy's asking, I wonder how we model this in our PD for teachers. Does anyone have suggestions? I know one thing that sparks a lot of joy and creativity that we do at CAST and some of our professional learning is we'll do activities where we'll allow choice in how you express yourself. So, you know, let's solidify our understanding of what UDL is, or let's solidify our understanding of the engagement principle. And you can express yourself in a poem, in a song, in an essay, in any way you like. And that just brings out all the creative juices, and people work together, and you can work on your own or together, and people work together, and really it sparks a lot of joy and play. So even that just like simple choice of, you don't have to share out, right? You don't share out on a poster paper, but you can share out in the way that feels the most engaging to you, can be helpful.
Some of the other wonderful things coming up in the chat around strategies are things like gamification. Instead of saying joy and play, gamification, we know that today's world is heavy on technology and development. So I love the gamification idea, because that does resonate with a lot of our older learners. Things like Kahoot, I do that in college as well. And I know my daughter in her 3rd grade class does that too, right?
Yeah.
I see Legos. Oh my gosh, Legos are a thing. Like they really are for both younger and older folks. It's amazing. So I appreciate all the comments and ideas that we're developing in the chat.
Yeah, there's lots of stuff in there. Thinking about how joy varies too. Elif is asking us to think about how joy varies in people find joy in other things. And I wish we could keep talking about this, but we got one more to go and about 10 more minutes. So we're going to move on to empathy and restorative practices. But keep it coming. Talk to each other in the chat, share your ideas. All right, you ready, Shantae, for empathy quiz?
I am ready, even though Zoom just kicked me off. I am back again.
My goodness.
So I know, right? So we started this time with quotes, right? We do have a definition. Actually, let's go back since we've been doing that. Can we go to the definition, since that's how we've been starting, and then we'll go back? Yeah, thank you. So I wanted again to start with definitions that we're operating under, if you will. Oh, or Melissa, if you want to talk to this, because I know these are the ones that you created.
This is my love language, restorative practice in particular.
It brings you joy.
It brings me joy. It does. So the Suffolk Center for Restorative Justice is here in Boston. It's out of Suffolk Law, the law school in Suffolk. Suffolk University, and they define restorative practices as restorative practice involve interventions when harm has happened, and we as practice and as well as practices that help prevent harm and conflict by creating a sense of belonging, safety, and social responsibility within the school community. So they're very clear that restorative practices are not only when someone's in trouble, they're not only when something bad has happened, but you do them proactively, start to learn more about each other, share your emotions in this circle practice or in these conversations, being open to one another, so that when harm does occur, that we already have this practice of how do we work together to solve things. And then empathy, and I don't know how to say this researcher's name, Shantae, but I'm going to take a stab. Kurtzinak. Empathy is the art of stepping into the shoes of another person, understanding their feelings and perspectives, and using that understanding to guide your actions. So Shantae and I spent some time really looking for a definition of empathy that is in keeping with the spirit of UDL 3.0, because we want it to convey we don't want it to convey sympathy or feeling sorry. We want it to convey really trying to understand where someone is coming from and their experience, and thinking about how can we use that to guide our actions and our interactions with them.
I love that. So we can go to the previous. There we go. And so just some of the empathy quotes, and really these were some comments that were, again, brought forth during our advisory board. And we asked the participants, what would it look like if classrooms engaged all learners in developing empathy and interdependent collective learning, which is another consideration as part of our 3.0 guidelines. And some of the ideas that came out, as you see on the Jamboard, but some of the things that I wanted to surface were that learners would empathize with each other. Learners would feel their emotions freely as they're learning. Learners would be braver, right? And learners would know that it's okay to make mistakes. That one was very powerful. And then learners would communicate in a caring way. So I totally can appreciate many of the comments that came forth when we think about what does an empathetic learning environment look like. And so not only do you appreciate, do you feel valued, right? But you appreciate the learning experiences, perspectives, and outlooks of other people. So we can go. And so some of the themes that we brought forth in 3.0 guidelines is that we wanted to create a space for learners to develop the skills and knowledge that created a safe space for both the classroom community and cultures. We wanted our learners to feel valued, right? To feel safe, to feel brave, to be their authentic selves. And then we thought to ourselves, how might the guidelines more fully emphasize restoration and healing? And so this specifically was talking or was mentioned as it relates to trauma that may have been developed or experienced within schools. And so what has or how has perhaps school-based experience developed, traumatic experiences for our students, and how could can the guidelines, how can we consider practices in that healing, in that restorative approach to heal that? And so just again, highlighting 3 examples of some of the research that supported our considerations. One was by Swan in 2021, who really looked at how people were defining empathy, right? And so they talk about the fact that not only can we actually define empathy, but we can actually teach about it, right? And it can be practiced, we can see it. And so when teachers have developed this empathetic characteristic, they're able to recognize learners and students' signals, whether it's related to their cognition or behaviors, and be able to respond in a more empathetic way. And so this article, I think, was fascinating in developing or sharing what are some of those things, what are some of those signals that we that may help us be more mindful of, or be more mindful, but be more be more empathetic as we respond to students. The next article here by Martin focused on really using restorative practices, or the mindset, if you will, but focused on empathy. And so they used an approach, and this was a man who talked about his experience in a school setting where, the morale was down and the climate was down, and the school and its systems were really failing the students because they had this very punitive approach to everything, really. And so the school embraced this restorative approach, and they set a restorative mindset to help not only the teachers be more empathetic, but to look at their policies, and also to, when they found that when they employed these restorative practices, that it helped students become more empathetic, but also help them make different choices. And I say the right decisions. So when they had to choose between, decision A and decision B, that empathy kicked in, and they were able to do things like increase attendance and have more family involvement because of the focus on empathy and restorative practice. And then the last one is very interesting because it talks about kind of the tension between students or individuals showing up as their quote unquote authentic selves and being empathetic. So if I show up as my authentic self, which y'all, I have to say, sometimes I'm loud or passionate, right? Can someone truly empathize with me, right? And so there are these ideals one and the same? Can they support one another? So I challenge you to go read that article to see what the article says about that, because sometimes those two things can work against each other. And so we just want to be mindful of how they can be used to support creating empathetic environments for our learners.
And Shante, we have in the chat some of this more like intertwining of these ideas. So we had a comment that said, empathy is the gateway to belonging. And then based on what you just said around showing up as your authentic self, it appears to me that addressing bias is essential to empathy. So they're all kind of intertwined, and we have to make space for all of that in our learning environments. So we only have a few more minutes, so we'll just go over a few strategies. There's more in the deck, but and you can look at some of the restorative practices things as you go along. But one strategy for developing empathy is that circle practice. Really, it's spending time thinking about protocols for students to really listen to one another and share with one another so they can better understand each other. Facilitate learners sharing not only their coping strategies, but their coping needs and even their emotions. So there's research that tells us that the more words we have for emotion, the better we understand emotion, and then we can identify emotion in each other, and that really grows our social emotional skills. There's protocols like a buddy bench in an elementary school where you sit if you need a friend at recess, Or if we're talking about higher ed, we could have accountability partners, different ways to build relationships and help students build relationships with one another. Co-creating, facilitating classroom agreements, and facilitating kind accountability if those agreements are broken. So things like our circles for restorative practices, oops and ouch, where I can say, ouch, you hurt me. And Shantae can say, oops, I didn't mean to. But I recognize my impact, right? The calling in and as opposed to calling out people, really taking time to really talk about the issues and making communal decisions through those restorative practices about how to restore the whole community after an agreement has been broken. Because in the restorative practice, the tenets are relationships are important. It's at the center, right? We are hardwired to connect, and everyone deserves to be treated with respect, regardless of how they behaved. All involved in an incident should be part of the healing, and those persons who are responsible should take accountability for the impact of their actions. But the community should determine the solution together, and the needs of the community and the person responsible should be addressed. And as we said at the beginning, it can be both proactive and reactive, because the key takeaways from using those restorative practices in classrooms is that humans are hardwired to connect. And those restorative practices help students to learn those social skills around empathy, identification of emotions, how to collaborate, how to be accountable within a community. And as we said, many of these ideas are sort of intertwined, and they build on one another and make space for each other. So as we end, any last words, Shantae?
No, just that I appreciate all the engagement and activity within the chat. I love the connections that were made, and we will definitely be saving the chat and ensuring that many of your comments, suggestions, recommendations are further enhanced or further are part of our conversation as we teach about the enhancements to 3.0. So thank you.
Thanks. Thank you. So we have a couple, if you're interested in more professional learning at CAS, you can email that PL. We have our workshop series that Patrice will put in the chat. And for next steps, just think to yourself as you sign off. It's not showing up on my screen here.
It is. It's up here.
Oh, it's coming now. Here we go. Something that affirmed your thinking, pushed your thinking. What might your learners need you to do next? So thank you, everybody.
Thank you all.